These war movies were made while World War II was still happening. Some of them have real soldiers in the cast. One was released the same day as D-Day. Most people think old war movies are boring. Let's see what happens when you put them to the test in 2025. The British Army had a problem in 1943. They needed more infantry recruits, so they commissioned a couple of writers to make a training short that would convince people to enlist. The short was called The New Lot, and apparently it worked well enough that they decided to expand it into a full feature film. The movie follows a bunch of British civilians who get conscripted after Dunkirk. Bank clerk, travel agent, loudmouth cockney, just regular guys who absolutely do not want to be there. They go through basic training under this lieutenant played by David Niven. Here's the thing about Niven though, when they made this movie, he wasn't just an actor playing a soldier, he was a British Army major. He literally came back from active duty to star in this film, then presumably went back to the war. The production value is insane for something made during an active war. They're collapsing real buildings on camera. The naval effects look convincing. And then they released it on D-Day while the biggest amphibious invasion in history was happening. The final shot of the film became so iconic that decades later, Dad's Army copied it for their closing credits. And even in 2025, it still sits at perfect 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. April 18, 1942. The Doolittle Raid hits Tokyo. It's the first American airstrike on the Japanese homeland after Pearl Harbor. Some of the bombers don't make it. One crew gets captured. The 8 captured airmen are put on trial at police headquarters. All 8 are sentenced to death. Hollywood made a movie about this in 1944 while the war was still going. Dana Andrews plays one of the captured airmen. The film shows everything from their capture to the trial and execution. Is it propaganda? Absolutely. There are scenes where Japanese soldiers are dancing around sword fighting like cartoon villains. It hits every wartime stereotype. When it came out, audiences probably walked out ready to enlist. But underneath all that Hollywood melodrama, the core story is true. Those men were really captured. They were really tortured. They were really put on trial. 3 of them were really executed. That actually happened. So yeah, parts of it are ridiculous, but it's built on something real and you can feel that weight even through the over-the-top stuff. Hollywood made 4 different movies about the Doolittle Raid during World War II. This one is the most historically accurate. The screenplay was written by Dalton Trumbo based on a book by Captain Ted Lawson, who was a pilot on the actual raid. Lawson flew the mission, survived it, wrote about what happened, and Trumbo turned it into a script. Spencer Tracy plays Doolittle. Van Johnson leads the crew of the Ruptured Duck, which was a real plane with the real crew's names. They used actual footage of B-25 bombers taking off from the USS Hornet. This wasn't Hollywood inventing characters and situations. These were real people doing a real mission. The Doolittle Raid was basically a suicide mission. Fully loaded bombers had to take off from an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific, fly to Japan, bomb Tokyo, and then try to make it to China before running out of fuel. The math barely worked. A lot of them didn't make it. What makes this movie work is that it doesn't oversell it. Director Mervyn LeRoy shoots it almost like a documentary. The acting is good, it's in black and white, and it shows what happened to these men after the raid, which wasn't pretty. The movie was made in 1944 by people who lived through what they're depicting. You can feel that authenticity in every frame. A Walk in the Sun doesn't look like a war movie. There's barely any action in it. Most of what happens in the movie happens off screen. You hear things in the distance, you see characters react, but you rarely see the actual combat. The plot is simple. American platoon needs to destroy a bridge in Italian territory. That's the whole movie, just watching them try to get there. It was based on a novel by Harry Brown, who wrote for this Army publication called Yank during the war. The Army assigned this guy Colonel Thomas Drake as the film's technical advisor, and Drake had one hell of a story. He'd gone from private to sergeant in World War I, got commissioned later, eventually commanded an infantry regiment in North Africa. Then he and his entire regiment got captured by the Germans at Kasserine Pass. The Germans let him go in 1944 because his health was shot, and he came back to the States just in time to work on this movie. Here's what's interesting though, the movie doesn't treat the Germans like villains. Most war films from that time made the enemy into these cartoonish evil monsters, but A Walk in the Sun just shows German soldiers as shadows in the background. The Italian soldiers show up as these confused guys caught in the middle. There's no big speech about how evil the enemy is, it's just soldiers doing their job. There's a restored version on YouTube now. The pace is slow, there's barely any action, but it still works. They Were Expendable came out in September 1945, just 3 months after World War II ended in Europe. It follows two Navy lieutenants, John Wayne and Robert Montgomery, commanding patrol torpedo boats after Pearl Harbor. They're shooting down Japanese aircraft, destroying enemy ships, and running messages between Allied forces. Director John Ford had just been discharged from the Navy when he made this. He'd been at Midway when Japan attacked. He was on Omaha Beach during D-Day. Robert Montgomery, the co-star, had driven ambulances during the war and was at Normandy. A lot of the cast and crew had served, and the film lists their military ranks right there in the credits. That experience shows in the film. Wayne and Montgomery both give these really quiet performances, and the movie's not trying to pump you up or make war look glorious. It's showing what it looked like when American forces were getting their asses kicked and had to keep fighting anyway. Errol Flynn had a problem during World War II. He was making all these war movies, playing heroes, and people were starting to ask questions. Why wasn't he actually enlisted? Why was he just acting in these films instead of fighting? What the public didn't know is that Flynn had tried to enlist in every branch of the armed services and got rejected every single time. Heart condition, tuberculosis, malaria, back problems. He was medically unfit for service. Warner Brothers kept all of this quiet because they were worried it would hurt his box office draw. So Flynn did what he could. He showed up to these war movies and was reportedly at his most professional and cooperative when working on them. It was his way of contributing. Edge of Darkness was one of them. The setup is pretty straightforward. Nazi army invades Norway, sets up headquarters in this fishing village, and the locals are waiting for weapons so they can revolt. It's a melodrama, but it's a strong one. The characterization is what makes it work. These aren't cardboard cutouts, they're people caught in impossible situations trying to figure out what to do. And the movie still holds up because it's not trying to be an action spectacular. It's about occupation, about what happens to ordinary people when their country gets invaded. That story doesn't really age. Robert Mitchum got his only Oscar nomination for this one. The film itself got 4 Academy Award nominations total. It follows Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent Ernie Pyle as he travels with C Company of the 18th Infantry through Tunisia and Italy. It's basically a tribute to the ordinary American infantryman told through the eyes of the guy who wrote about them. The movie was directed by William Wellman, who was a combat veteran himself, and he had tremendous respect for his subject. And you can tell. The film doesn't clean anything up the way most war movies did. These guys are dirty, exhausted, living day to day in the grit of actual war. The tragic part is that by the time the movie was released, Ernie Pyle was already dead. He was killed covering combat in the Pacific, so he never got to see what they made from his work, never got to see Mitchum's performance or how Wellman translated his columns to screen. Humphrey Bogart made Casablanca, became a massive star, and Hollywood immediately wanted another war picture from him. So they gave him Sahara. The movie follows an American tank crew led by Bogart's character who picks up a bunch of stragglers during the retreat. They're low on water, the Germans are advancing, and they stumble onto this nearly dried-up oasis. Then Bogart learns that a whole German motorized battalion is also heading for that water. And instead of doing the smart thing, getting the hell out of there and heading for British lines, he decides they're going to stay and fight. Most propaganda films from that era were about heroes who couldn't lose. You'd watch some guy take out 50 enemy soldiers without breaking a sweat. Very inspiring and completely fake. Sahara doesn't do that. The movie never pretends these guys have good odds. They're outnumbered, outgunned, and the film knows it. and somehow that makes it feel less like propaganda and more like an actual story about people in an impossible situation. Howard Hawks and Hemingway were friends. So this one time they're on a fishing trip and Hawks tells him he could make a great movie from his worst book. Hemingway admits To Have and Have Not is probably his worst, and Hawks says, "All right, I'll prove it." What they made was Casablanca again. Guy running a business in occupied territory, trying to stay neutral. He gets pulled into helping the resistance and falls for a woman. People notice the similarities immediately. But none of that matters because of what happened on set. Hawks cast this unknown actress named Lauren Bacall opposite Humphrey Bogart. It was her first film. She was 19 years old, and she completely owns it. There's this thing that happens sometimes where you're watching an old movie and you can see the exact moment a star is born. This is one of those movies. Bogart's great, Walter Brennan gets good lines, but Bacall just takes over every scene she's in. The war plot is there, the French resistance, the Nazis, all of it. But really, you're watching two people fall in love right there on set. Well, Hawks proves he can turn Hemingway's worst novel into something worth watching. Rossellini made this in Rome in 1945. The war wasn't even over yet. Italy had just switched sides, the Nazis were still occupying parts of the country, and Rossellini's out there filming in actual ruins with whatever resources he could scrape together. The movie follows people in Rome trying to survive under occupation. There's a resistance fighter, a priest helping him, and regular people caught in the middle. Most war films have to recreate everything, build sets, hire costume designers, make it look like war. Rossellini didn't have to do any of that because he was filming in a city that had just been through it. The destroyed buildings were right there. The exhaustion on people's faces was real. He just pointed the camera at what was actually happening and filmed it. That approach created the Italian neo-realist movement, the idea that you don't need big budgets or fancy sets to make powerful cinema. You just need to show life as it actually is. The film won the top prize at Cannes Film Festival in 1946 and got an Oscar nomination. It was one of the first Italian films after the war to get major international attention. And it still has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, which for something made 80 years ago is pretty rare.